Bill Bergman is also an investment specialist, and he was with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago for years. Did some interesting work there that he told us about, and now he's with Morningstar, the big advisory on mutual funds. And the topic is really what I'm interested in. You know, we have the American Monetary Institute, we have a bank account, and I'm wondering about it. Really, some of you may also. We don't have big investments. The title of the talk is Cash in the Bank or Cash in Hand. I think you'll cover the topic. So welcome, Bill Bergman.
Thank you, Stephen. It was nice to meet both you and Jamie the other day, and I appreciate your appreciation for history, and that's part of the talk. I'm going to be talking and try to get a fun slice of life from the early 1900s accounting history, and some modern twists on that are kind of interesting. By way of background, I grew up here in the Chicago area. Went to the University of Chicago for grad school, U of I undergrad, Chicago for grad school, an MBA and another master's in public policy in 1990, and I worked at the Chicago Fed for 13 years as an economist for 8 years, and as a financial markets policy analyst for about 5 years. And in that latter role, I had some really interesting projects, a fair amount of independence and research, and had a few things. For instance, one thing, I'll just by way of background, you know, you and I use banks, but banks use each other as well. And thinking about how banks pay each other money as opposed to how you and I pay each other money using banks is a very interesting area. And a lot of technical stuff, but the amount of money that goes over these interbank payment systems during the day, the banks pay each other trillions of dollars a day to fund the financial markets and the world economy at large. And how these systems are set up and the risks that the banks take and how they're priced and how the Federal Reserve acts in the center of the system is a very interesting area that not too many people know about. And it's very dry on the surface, but it's very interesting underneath. Another project that I got in trouble there, another place where I got in trouble was a project on what happens during 2001. I developed a paper looking at the current administration, what happens during a presidentially declared national emergency or a time of war for the independence of the Federal Reserve System, which is a very complex topic all by itself. The accountability, really, of the Federal Reserve System is how it should be talked about. And we have some very, very interesting laws on the books that aren't just interesting, dating to the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917 and the Emergency Banking Relief Act in 1933. And the amount of scope of authority that they provide for the executive branch over the banking and financial markets during a time of crisis is really extraordinary. When you know, in sixth grade, we woke up and read our books, and we were told that we had kind of a free market capitalism at work here in the United States. But when you read the laws on the books that were used in 1933 to close down the nation's banking system under very, questionable authority, but the authority was asserted, and that's the main point. Well, that was a very interesting paper. I got interested in that and got some very good feedback on it from a senior constitutional law scholar in the United States in August 2001. And I ended up presenting that paper at the Library of Congress in November 2001. Finally, the last place I got in trouble was looking at, my last project there was in the money laundering area. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's a modern twist, perhaps on the topic I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then we can go to, I'm sure you guys are kind of tired at the end of the day. There's a lot of thought-provoking stuff in those last few speakers that I saw, and I wanted to keep talking about what they were talking about. But we'll go with the accounting history is the project, I gave a paper at an accounting history conference for these accounting historians, the academics, and it was a lot of fun getting into, first I was in this area looking at fair value accounting. Have you heard about fair value accounting? Do you know what that is? The area of accounting where they're trying to measure financial instruments at their fair value as opposed to their book value. And it's a very difficult area, especially in this derivatives arena, which is under stress right now. But I stepped back for a minute and said, okay, now wait a minute. If it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If this fair value accounting is something that's good for the really complicated financial instruments, let's think about it strictly with respect to the cash account. The simplest account, the account at the top of the balance sheet for any balance sheet, is the top line is the cash account. Why is it at the top line? Where did that come from? Where did that convention start? And it's very interesting when I started looking back into the history of this stuff. Going back, and I probably didn't go back far enough on the accounting history, but I went back at least to the early 1900s. It goes back further. Luciano Pacioli or whatever, there's a guy in Italy who did a lot of accounting work that's very important. And that was about 1400s or so. But in the early 1900s, two very influential accounting textbooks came out in the United States that ultimately ended up flowering into what we now have as the generally accepted accounting principles. One of them was written by Charles Ezra Sprague. It was called The Philosophy of Accounts. And he was a banker. He was the president of the Union Dime Savings Bank in New York, and he also wrote the first CPA law in the state of New York. And another very, very influential accounting textbook that came out at that time was by a person named Henry Rand Hatfield, who was an academic who had actually had previous banking experience, including banking experience in a bank that failed. And it was called Modern Accounting. These books came out with copyright dates of 1908 and 1909. What happened the year before 1908? The panic in 1907. So, okay, well, what did these guys say about the cash account after the panic in 1907? Well, accounts receivable, you got to be really careful. We're really conservative in our accounting principles, they said. You've got to discount accounts receivable. Some of those guys, they won't pay you back. And they, horses, boy, we've got to be careful. They can run away. They can jump over the fence. These are assets that you got to be very careful about. But you can sell a horse for cash. And cash is cash. That's at the top of the balance sheet. We're going to put it at the top, and we're going to measure everything else in its current cash value, because cash is what matters. Cash is the most important thing, and cash is cash. Oh yes, there's two kinds. There's cash on hand, and there's cash in a bank. And we're going to put them in the same account because they're equal, because we say so, because cash is cash. And this is coming right after the panic in 1907, when a lot of Americans decided that cash on hand was something a little more valuable than cash in the bank. Now, why did they do this? I would suspect, it needs more research, but I would like to understand better their linkages with people in the banking system. That in turn led to the formation of the National Monetary Commission, and in turn the development of the central bank in 1913, after the panic in 1907. After the panic in 1907, we developed a central bank to try to make these two unequal things equal, to try to help that liquidity, to create an elastic currency. And it's interesting how the old accounting stuff and the old accounting history plays into that. So we added the central bank on top in order to try to make these two unequal things equal. 20 years later, what happened? The worst banking panic we've ever had in the United States, despite the fact that we had the cure for the banking panics. Or maybe not just despite, but because of what the Federal Reserve was doing. What happened after that? Well, we got another accounting textbook. First of all, I got to read one thing that in my research that was a lot of fun. We have at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, one of my favorite places was the library. A lot of old stuff in the library. A lot of old books from the old days. You look back at some of this original stuff, and including one of the things that we don't just have old books. We had old copies of Barron's, the weekly financial thing. And here's a line from Barron's, March 13th, 1933. That's right after the bank holiday. On the Harvard University campus, the banking panic exerted its influence. A check of upperclassmen revealed an average hoard of the nation's currency of 22 cents each. However, 4 of the 40 students canvassed had empty pockets and were regarded with envy by their classmates who could confess to the possession only of bank checks from home. In other words, people with bank checks were envious of the people with 22 cents in their pocket. And well, it was a bad, we're laughing now, but it was a bad time, financial markets. It was a panic. And so we had, it's kind of clear that bank money is, as opposed to cash on hand. Well, the guy who was the editor is a thorough, ongoing thing that comes out of the accounting profession called the Accountant's Handbook. In fact, we've got recent editions of this thing. But there were 2 editions that came out both before and after. The second edition came out with copyright dates of 32 and 34. And it was edited by a fellow named W.A. Payton, who actually wrote a celebratory foreword to the reissue in 1972 of, remember I mentioned Charles Ezra Sprague's book, The Philosophy of Accounts? It was reissued in 1972, just prior to the development of the Financial Accounting Standards Board in the United States. And it had a foreword to that book that was developed by W.A. Payton, who was the editor of this book back, and I'll mention what he said about cash in a minute. And he was talking about how wonderful Charles Ezra Sprague was and these wonderful ideas. And well, anyway, here's what this handbook said about cash just before and just after by far and away the worst panic we've ever had in our US banking history. The commercial bank account is the most important element in the cash of the typical concern due to the modern practice of making payment by check. Most of the cash of the representative enterprise is in the form of bank balances, which are in essence nothing more than very liquid and dependable receivables. Anything is cash, therefore, which is generally acceptable, whether or not it is legal tender. Cash is also an asset which possesses complete fixity of value, ignoring the question of the change in the value of money due to the changes in the price level. In other words, cash is cash, cash on hand or cash in the bank, right before and right after the worst banking panic in our nation's history. It's kind of like we set up an accounting system to try to say that what the value of bank money is, and then we added the FDIC on top of the Fed in order to try to ensure that these two unequal things were equal, again. And today, well, the term moral hazard is, we're reaping the fruits of all the guarantees that we've extended in the system as citizens to the rest of the financial markets. And it's a little bit sad, and I share a lot of the concern that I've heard expressed about our current financial market predicament. But this is a little bit of the historical background to it that I thought I'd like to share with you. There is a modern twist on this that I'd just like to share with you too. With M1 is the narrowest monetary aggregate. M1, M2, M3. M1 is theoretically the most narrow type of money that's out there. What are the two main things in M1? What else? One more?
Checking accounts.
Checking accounts.
Demand
Cash on hand, cash in the bank.
Yeah.
That's the narrow, two very different things, but they're in that M1. Since World War II, the three fastest growing months in the currency component of M1, I'm talking about this stuff that's outside of banks. The fastest single growing month was December 1999. Y2K? Concern about money in banks. The second fastest growing month since World War II, out of those 700 months or so, was January 1991. Go ahead. Gulf War, did I hear? Gulf War was, there's this phenomenon called wartime hoarding that helps explain why currency tends to go up compared to other types of money during wartime. There's a variety of interesting explanations. There was also in that month an important enforcement month in the BCCI money laundering scandal. I'm curious if that's part of the program as well. So, and then I'll leave it with just with the last one, is the third fastest growing month since World War II, out of those 700 months or so. The third fastest growing month since World War II in the currency component of M1 is August 2001.
Before 9/11.
There may be a completely benign explanation. There was a banking crisis that was flowering in Argentina. And widows and orphans looking for billions of dollars of $100 bills may have been entirely responsible. That's the end of my presentation.